Nolan Wells was 18 years old, a college football player with a future that seemed wide open. On July 4, 2026, he traveled with friends to Horn Island off the Mississippi Gulf Coast for a holiday gathering. By the end of that day, something had gone terribly wrong. Nolan was no longer with the group, and 2 days later, his body was discovered near the island. What happened between those moments remains the central question. Early in the investigation, drowning was considered a possible explanation. But as Nolan's family began pushing for more answers, questions emerged about his final movements, the people around him, and what could be established from the available evidence. The case eventually attracted the attention of Carlos Moore, a former Mississippi judge and attorney who publicly discussed the legal significance of the evidence. Moore's comments were striking because he suggested that, depending on what investigators could establish in an affidavit, certain evidence could potentially justify a warrant. But there is an important distinction that cannot be overlooked. Moore did not issue a warrant. His comments were a legal opinion, not a judicial finding that someone was responsible for Nolan's death. A warrant requires probable cause supported by evidence, and probable cause is not the same thing as proving guilt. Meanwhile, Nolan's family sought answers through an independent forensic examination. They hoped another autopsy might finally explain what happened to their son. Instead, the independent examination reached a conclusion that was far more complicated. The cause and manner of Nolan's death were classified as undetermined pending further investigation. The examination did not establish homicide, but it also did not provide the family with a definitive explanation for how Nolan died. And that is where the story becomes even more complicated, because buried inside the autopsy findings were details that raised new questions about Nolan's final hours. If you want to follow this case as verified information develops, subscribe, like this video, and share it with others following Nolan's story. Because before anyone can decide what happened, we have to understand what the forensic evidence actually found. The independent autopsy did not produce the simple answer Nolan Wells' family had hoped for. Instead, it revealed a forensic picture that was difficult to interpret, especially because Nolan's body had undergone significant decomposition before the examination. According to the publicly reported findings, forensic pathologist Dr. Roger Mitchell classified both the cause and manner of death as undetermined pending further investigation. That conclusion is important because it does not mean the pathologist determined that Nolan was murdered. At the same time, it did not establish drowning as the definitive cause of death. One of the findings that attracted attention was a large area of red discoloration in the deep tissue over the back of Nolan's skull. That detail has been discussed extensively because people naturally want to know whether it represents an injury. But the forensic evidence does not allow that conclusion to be made automatically. The reported examination found no skull fracture beneath the area of discoloration and no deep tissue injury that definitively explained what caused the change in appearance. In a decomposed body, discoloration can be difficult to interpret, and determining whether a finding occurred before death, around the time of death, or afterward can require careful forensic analysis. That distinction matters enormously. A mark on a body is not automatically proof of an assault. Investigators have to determine its origin, timing, and significance by comparing it with the rest of the forensic evidence. And this is where Nolan's case becomes increasingly complicated. The independent examination was not taking place under ideal conditions. Decomposition can destroy or alter evidence that might otherwise help establish a cause of death. It can make injuries harder to identify and can complicate interpretations of tissue changes. So while the autopsy raised questions, it did not answer the central mystery: what actually caused Nolan's death? And if the independent examination could not determine that, investigators would have to look beyond one finding and reconstruct the entire timeline. If you want to keep following the evidence rather than the rumors surrounding this case, subscribe, like, and share this video. Because the most important forensic question may not be what was found on Nolan's body. It may be what could no longer be examined. One of the most important limitations surrounding the independent autopsy was not simply what the pathologist found, but what the pathologist could no longer examine. By the time Dr. Roger Mitchell conducted the independent examination, Nolan Wells' body had already undergone significant decomposition. That process can change tissues, obscure injuries, and make certain forensic conclusions much more difficult. In a case where the central question is how someone died, those limitations can become critical. There was another complication. Some internal structures from Nolan's neck and throat were not available to the independent pathologist because they had been retained during the earlier state examination. That does not, by itself, mean anything improper happened. In forensic investigations, tissue and organs may be retained for additional testing when investigators believe they could contain important evidence. But their absence meant that Dr. Mitchell could not independently evaluate every possible finding involving those structures. That distinction is especially important because some people have interpreted the missing structures as evidence that something was being hidden. There is no established evidence supporting that conclusion. What can responsibly be said is that the independent examination had limitations, and those limitations help explain why the final conclusion remained undetermined. The autopsy could identify certain findings, but it could not confidently connect those findings to a specific cause of death. It could not establish that Nolan was assaulted, and it could not definitively establish that he drowned. That left investigators with a much bigger task. They would have to combine the forensic findings with everything else. The timeline on Horn Island, witness accounts, GPS information, phone records, photographs, videos, toxicology, and the official state examination. And that is where the comments from Carlos Moore become relevant. Moore has argued that when investigators believe evidence establishes probable cause, warrants can become an important tool for obtaining information that might otherwise remain unavailable. But probable cause is not a conviction. It is a legal threshold that allows investigators to take a particular investigative step. If you are following Nolan's case and want to see what the evidence eventually reveals, subscribe, like, and share this video, because the autopsy may not have answered the mystery, but it may have shown investigators exactly where the unanswered questions begin. Carlos Moore's comments bring the investigation back to a question that is often misunderstood in true crime cases. What does it actually mean when a lawyer or former judge says the evidence could justify a warrant? A warrant is not a declaration that someone is guilty. It is a legal authorization allowing investigators to search for specific evidence when the required legal standard has been met. That standard is generally based on probable cause, meaning there must be sufficient facts and circumstances to reasonably support the belief that evidence of a crime may be found. That distinction is critical in Nolan Wells' case. Moore has publicly discussed evidence surrounding Nolan's death and argued that investigators should consider appropriate warrants when the available information supports them. But Moore did not personally issue a warrant, and his comments do not establish that Nolan was murdered or that any particular person committed a crime. The independent autopsy itself does not provide that conclusion. Instead, it leaves the cause and manner of death undetermined. That means investigators must look at the autopsy alongside everything else they can establish about Nolan's final hours. What did witnesses see? What do the GPS records show? What do phone records reveal? What information exists on videos and photographs from that day? And perhaps most importantly, does the complete forensic evidence support one explanation over another? These are the questions that can turn suspicion into evidence, or demonstrate that a theory does not hold up. For Nolan's family, the legal arguments and forensic findings are not abstract. They are part of a search for an explanation of how an 18-year-old lost his life. And if additional warrants are eventually sought, their significance will depend entirely on what investigators discover through them. If you have been following this case and want updates based on evidence rather than online speculation, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with others following Nolan's story. Because the phrase, "I'd sign the warrant," sounds dramatic. But the real question is much more important. What evidence would investigators put in front of a judge, and where would that evidence lead? At the center of the Nolan Wells investigation is a question that no public statement, viral video, or single forensic finding has been able to answer. How did Nolan die? The independent autopsy commissioned by his family did not provide a definitive answer. The cause and manner of death remained undetermined, and the examination was limited by decomposition and the absence of certain internal structures that had been retained during the earlier examination. That means the findings have to be understood for what they actually establish and what they do not. The reported discoloration over the back of Nolan's skull did not come with a confirmed explanation, and the examination did not establish a skull fracture or definitive deep tissue injury beneath it. The available findings, therefore, cannot responsibly be transformed into proof that Nolan was assaulted. At the same time, the unanswered questions remain significant. The official state autopsy and other investigative evidence are critical because they may provide information that the independent examination could not. Investigators can compare the forensic findings with toxicology, witness statements, GPS records, phone data, photographs, videos, and the timeline of Nolan's final known movements. That is also where Carlos Moore's comments become important, but only as a legal perspective. His statement about signing a warrant should not be mistaken for a warrant actually being issued. It means that, in his view, evidence could potentially justify further legal action if the appropriate standard were met. Whether investigators ultimately seek warrants, whether a judge grants them, and what those searches might reveal are separate questions. For Nolan's family, however, the legal terminology cannot erase the personal reality. They still want to know what happened to their son. If this story has raised questions for you, subscribe, like, and share the video so more people can follow the investigation responsibly. And remember, questions are not convictions and suspicion is not proof. The most important evidence may still be ahead. Because when the complete forensic record is finally considered alongside the timeline, digital evidence, witness accounts, and every other verified piece of information, investigators may finally be able to answer the question that has haunted Nolan's family since that 4th of July. What really happened to Nolan Wells?